In the twilight of medieval Europe, as the clamor of feudal warlords echoed across dying kingdoms, a strange and wondrous thing was born, not from conquest, but from covenant. In 1385, beneath the vaulted skies of Krzywo, two paths merged into one. The Lithuanian Grand Duke Jogaila, baptized Władysław, took the Polish crown and a Polish queen, and with her the destiny of a people. From that marriage sprang the seed of something unlike any other in the world, a republic of nobles, a union of swords and quills, of Catholic and Orthodox, of forest and field, of east and west. This was not an empire built on domination, but a commonwealth built on oath, later sanctified at Lublin in 1569, when Poland and Lithuania, sovereign and proud, sealed their eternal bond. There, amid oaths and tears and the rustling of parchment, the great republic of the two nations emerged, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. It was not merely a state, but an idea, a dream of shared rule, of liberty guarded by sword and pen alike. In an age where monarchs crushed parliaments and heretics burned, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth stood as a singular flame. The Złota Wolność, Golden Liberty, was its soul, a pact between the king and the nobility, where no tyrant reigned unchecked, where kings were chosen, not born to rule. To the Szlachta, the noble class, it was a divine trust, to guard freedom, even at the cost of chaos. They elected their kings at vast royal fields beneath open sky, where every noble, whether rich magnate or poor knight, cast his vote as an equal. Freedom rang loud in that land, intoxicating and dangerous. Yet for all its tensions, this experiment bore fruit. The Commonwealth became a titan, not by conquest, but by cohesion. Its cities thrived with trade, its universities with Latin verse, its courts with law, instead of arbitrary rule. Religious tolerance, enshrined by the Warsaw Confederation of 1573, offered shelter while Europe tore itself apart in sectarian war. Calvinists, Orthodox, Armenians, Jews, all found a place under the twin crowns. Its armies, too, thundered across the fields of history. In 1605, at Kirchholm, a vastly outnumbered Polish force, the famed Husaria with their wings of death, shattered the Swedish host, turning the tide with courage and steel. Against Muscovite Tsars, the Commonwealth stood tall, marching into the Kremlin itself in 1610, the only foreign army ever to do so. These were not mere wars of ambition, but assertions of vitality, proof that liberty and order, so often estranged, could ride side by side into battle. And in the hearts of her people bloomed a rare pride, not the pride of blood or conquest, but of shared endeavor. This was a nation not confined to a single tongue or tribe, but one that spoke in many voices, prayed in many ways, and yet dreamed as one. From Krakow to Vilno, from Lwów to Smolensk, there pulsed a single, unifying hope, that a free people, rightly bound, could defy the tides of time. Yet all dawns cast shadows. Even in this golden morning, beneath the triumphs and ideals, there flickered the faintest hint of fragility, a system too dependent on virtue, too allergic to reform, too trusting in its own myth. But in that moment, none could see it. The Commonwealth stood radiant, a beacon of liberty in a world descending into chains. And oh, how it glowed, proud and vast and shining, as if it might last forever. It was a republic without a people, and yet more democratic than any realm the world had seen, a nation governed not by kings alone, but by the swords and signatures of its nobility. The Szlachta, some 500,000 souls amid a sea of peasants and townsmen, formed the living skeleton of the Commonwealth. Their pride was unmatched, their sense of freedom fierce and sacred. In their minds, they were not mere subjects, but co-rulers, every noble a senator of the land, every manor a miniature republic. The crown, to them, was not a master, but a contract. Power flowed upward from the consent of the Szlachta, and woe to the monarch who forgot it. This was the peculiar genius of Polish-Lithuanian democracy, a political culture where liberty was not the gift of rulers, but the inheritance of the nobility. The same, the great parliament, met under vaulted ceilings, and watched by the wary eyes of history. Kings sat in its presence not as God's anointed, but as partners bound by law. Here, the affairs of the Commonwealth were debated not by royal decree, but by the murmuring storm of noble voices, each one with power enough to hold the wheels of state. At the core of this strange mechanism stood the liberum veto, the liberating curse. Any deputy in any session could rise and declare Nepozwalam, I do not allow it, and with that single utterance dissolved the entire Sejm. No law would pass, no tax be raised, no war declared. One voice, one conscience could paralyze the whole. To the Slakta, it was the highest form of liberty, the shield against tyranny, the final guarantee that no faction, no king, no foreign intrigue could trample their rights. And for a time, it worked. It forced compromise. It demanded consensus. It protected the fragile balance between power and freedom. There was beauty in it. In an age when kings scrawled laws in blood, the Commonwealth negotiated them in ink and indignation. There was also humanity. In the Warsaw Confederation of 1573, where Polish nobles declared that no man should be persecuted for his faith. At a time when the fires of the Inquisition scorched Europe, Poland was a sanctuary. Armenian churches stood beside Catholic cathedrals. Jewish scholars debated law in Krakow while Lutheran towns thrived in Royal Prussia. This tolerance was not born of abstract theory, but of necessity, and it became a virtue, a rare light in a darkening age. The decentralization of power, too, brought resilience. Local diets, sejmiks, governed the regions with a keen eye for local needs. Governors answered not to distant thrones, but to their neighbors. It was a web of obligation, duty, and shared privilege that made tyranny almost impossible, but made unity just as elusive. And therein lay the tragedy, for the very strengths that made the Commonwealth noble also made it fragile. As magnates grew richer, they began to twist liberty into license. They bribed and bought deputies, turning the liberum veto into a weapon of obstruction. Foreign powers soon saw its value. A single coin, slipped into the right hand, could silence the entire state. Sessions dissolved in chaos, years passed without a single law. Reform died in the cradle again and again as patriots watched helplessly. What had once been a noble shield became an iron chain. The Slakta, so proud of their freedom, could not see that it had become a trap. They clung to old rights while new threats gathered. The Commonwealth, stretched vast and thin, bled slowly from within, not from lack of courage nor from lack of love, but from the fatal belief that what had once saved them would always do so. They could not yet know how cruel history would be, how soon the great edifice would creak and sway. For now they still toasted to freedom, wrote verses in Latin, and believed they had mastered the art of liberty. But the winds were shifting, and liberty, so hard won and so jealously guarded, would soon be the reason they lost the very state it was meant to protect. Then came the storms, swift and merciless, crashing upon the golden halls of the Commonwealth like waves against a crumbling cliff. It was not a single invasion or betrayal, but a series of shattering blows from every direction, east, west, within, as if history itself had turned against the fragile dream of liberty and unity. The mid-17th century was an age of reckoning when ideals were burned away in fire, and the proud republic learned that even the most beautiful order could bleed. The first crack echoed from the steppes. In 1648, the Khmelnytsky uprising burst forth like a flame, long smoldering beneath the skin of the realm. The Cossacks, wild riders of the Dnieper, had once fought for the Commonwealth, their sabers shedding blood in its name. But they had also been denied status, denied voice, denied the dignity they demanded from a state they helped defend. Bohdan Khmelnytsky, betrayed and grieving, forged rebellion into destiny. His uprising, brutal and relentless, tore through Ukraine like a plague. Cities burned, alliances shattered, and the Commonwealth's grip on its eastern lands began to loosen. It was not just a rebellion, it was a fracture of the soul. For in the Cossack fury, the Commonwealth beheld the cost of forgetting the very ideal it once championed. Liberty for some had bred fury in others. The brotherhood of nations that had formed the Commonwealth began to dissolve into mistrust, resentment, and fire. But worse still was yet to come. In 1655, as the Republic reeled from Cossack revolt and Russian pressure, the Swedes swept in from the north like a blade through unguarded flesh. This was the deluge, and it was not merely war, but annihilation. Sweden, led by Charles X Gustav, sought to drown the Commonwealth in speed and fury. Warsaw fell. Krakow was occupied. Even the sacred city of Częstochowa, where the Black Madonna wept behind monastery walls, stood under siege. And in these years, 1655 to 1660, Poland nearly ceased to be. It was a war not just against armies, but against the very memory of order. Churches were looted, libraries burned, villages erased from maps. The economy collapsed. 1/3 of the population vanished to fire, famine, and plague. The noble republic, once envied and admired, now lay in the dust, bruised by betrayal, staggering under the weight of her own ideals turned brittle. That it survived at all was a miracle of defiance. The slakta, peasantry, clergy, even wayward magnates rallied in desperation. And though the Swedes were driven out, the damage endured. The Commonwealth had not been defeated, but it had been mortally wounded, and yet in the ashes of ruin, a final star blazed bright, perhaps too bright, too brief. In 1683, a man rose who seemed to carry all the virtues of the Commonwealth within him, Jan III Sobieski, king and warrior, scholar and statesman. When the Ottoman horde laid siege to Vienna, gateway to Christendom, it was Sobieski who answered the call. With 20,000 Polish cavalry, he rode across Europe, crowned with urgency and faith. And at Kallenberg Hill on September 12, 1683, the thunder of hoofs became legend. His charge shattered the Turkish lines, broke the siege, and saved Vienna. Europe breathed. The Ottomans retreated, and the Polish king was hailed as the savior of the West. It was the last great triumph of the Commonwealth, the last time it would be seen not as a patient on a deathbed, but as the hero of history. Sobieski's victory glowed with the memory of what the Republic once was. Diverse, valorous, alive with purpose. Yet even he could not halt the decay. The structure beneath him was already eroding, the nobility still drunk on vetoes, the crown still weak, the reforms still whispers in the wind. Storms had come and gone, but they left behind a shattered mosaic. The Commonwealth endured, but in pieces, its soul scarred, its unity frayed, its brilliance now tinged with mourning. The dream still breathed, in verses, in battles, in memories. But the world had changed, and the storm had changed the Commonwealth with it forever. As the 18th century dawned, the Commonwealth still stood, vast, proud, adorned with the glories of centuries past, but it had become a theater of echoes, where the actors played roles long divorced from reality. Beneath its noble facades and ancient laws, a slow poison crept through its veins. The age of glory had faded into one of paralysis. And the republic that had once astonished Europe with its freedom now staggered under the weight of that very liberty, twisted and weaponized. The rot began not from without but from within. The great magnate families, Potokis, Czartoryskis, Radziwiłłs, ruled their private provinces like feudal kings, richer and more powerful than the monarch himself. The king was elected, yet crippled. The throne, once a sacred office of balance, was now the prize in a contest of ambition and foreign bribery. Each election became a battlefield not of ideas but of gold, Russian rubles, Prussian silver, Austrian threats, and every faction swore that their treachery was patriotism. The slakta, drunk on their ancient privileges, remained blind to the storm gathering beyond their borders. Reform was needed, reform was begged for, but one man in the same, one whisper of Nie pozwalam could turn the wheel backward. The liberum veto, once the proudest defense of noble liberty, became the instrument of paralysis. The Commonwealth's own constitution held a dagger to its throat. Sessions dissolved into nothing. Years passed without a single binding law. In 1717, under the watchful, mocking eye of Russia, the silent Sejm was held, a session where Poland was forbidden to speak. In silence, under duress, it accepted Russian guarantees. An act not of diplomacy but of submission. It was the beginning of guardianship in all but name. Russia's shadow grew long and cold, and the Polish court became a puppet stage. Catherine the Great moved pawns across Warsaw as easily as across Petersburg. The magnates were seduced by foreign promises and driven by petty rivalries. They formed confederations, political alliances with armed force, not to defend the nation, but to defeat one another. Civil war became a recurring plague, masked in rhetoric, drenched in blood. Noble against noble, cousin against cousin, each claiming the mantle of liberty, while trampling the last hope of unity. All the while, the people, the peasants who tilled the fields, the townsmen who lit the candles in synagogues and churches, watched in mute despair as their country devoured itself. There was no parliament of the people, no court for the commoner. The great republic had become a chessboard for others. And yet the nobility still toasted to freedom, still read Latin poetry, still believed that their sacred order could endure forever. The most tragic irony of all was this: the very freedoms that had once made the Commonwealth exceptional became the walls of its prison. The right of any noble to halt a law was now the tool by which foreign powers halted reform. The pride that once resisted tyranny now resisted change. The love of liberty had become idolatry, so absolute that even the survival of the state was sacrificed upon its altar. And thus, the Commonwealth began to drift, not with a scream, but with silence, with dysfunction, with bitter pride and the quiet footsteps of foreign diplomats. The great ship of state, so masterfully built in earlier centuries, now circled in dead waters, sails tangled by its own ideals, its wheel turned not by its people but by the cold hands of neighbors who smiled as they planned its dismemberment. The body still lived, but the soul was beginning to forget how to breathe. And yet, even as the Commonwealth seemed lost to stupor and subjugation, even as vultures circled and the noble class quarreled over ashes somewhere deep within the heart of Poland, a spark refused to die. It flickered low, but steady, not in grand palaces or gilded chambers, but in the minds of patriots, reformers, poets, soldiers. They saw through the rot, the betrayal, the paralysis, and dared to believe, one final time, that the Commonwealth could be reborn. That miracle, brief and blinding, came in the spring of 1791. On May 3rd, beneath the arches of the royal castle in Warsaw, a new constitution was proclaimed. The first in Europe, the second in the world, a document of enlightenment written not in the language of vengeance, but of redemption. The May 3rd Constitution was a cry against death, a desperate prayer to time, that what was sick could be healed, that liberty could be made sane again, that the ancient republic could become a modern state. It abolished the liberum veto. It ended the elective monarchy. It granted protections to townspeople, placed peasants under the law's protection, and forged a more centralized sovereign government. Still noble, still Polish, but no longer suicidal. It was compromise and courage entwined, a constitution born not from revolution's guillotine, but from love. Love of the fatherland, of its people, of the fragile dreams still worth saving. And for a moment, just a moment, Poland rose again, luminous and proud, but the world had grown crueler. Catherine the Great, Empress of a rising Russia, saw reform not as salvation, but as defiance. The Commonwealth, in her eyes, was not a partner, but a puppet, and puppets had no right to awaken. With the speed of a viper, she struck, calling on loyalist nobles to resist the new order. She cloaked invasion in the language of guarantees, but it was an open act of aggression. And once again, foreign boots marched through Polish fields. And then came the uprising, not orchestrated from courts, but from the blood of the people. Tadeusz Kościuszko, hero of two worlds, veteran of American liberty, returned to his homeland not with dreams of conquest, but with fire in his soul. In 1794, he took the oath in Krakow's Rynek Square, vowing to restore the republic or die in the attempt. With a peasant scythe in one hand and ideals in the other, he rallied the nation. Serfs, Jews, townsmen, nobles, all rose under his banner. At Rakowice, they defeated Russian troops with nothing but courage and sharpened farm tools. For the first time, the oppressed stood beside their old masters, united not by class, but by country. But the empires did not tremble. Prussia, that cold and calculating neighbor who had once sworn friendship to Poland, betrayed it with quiet efficiency. Austrian indifference, Russian ruthlessness, Prussian opportunism, three blades drawn at once. The uprising was crushed. Kościuszko was wounded, captured. Warsaw fell. Hope cracked. Still, what remained in those final days was more than defeat. The May Constitution, the uprising, the songs sung by children as the Russians entered the city. These were not signs of failure, but of life refusing to vanish. A nation on the brink had chosen not to go quietly. It had risen. It had dared. It had remembered itself. And though its enemies thought the flame extinguished, they did not see what had been lit. A memory that would outlast occupation, a constitution that would be read in secret, recited in exile, carved into the hearts of future generations. Even as partitions closed like tombstones over Poland's body, the soul had cried out, and the world had heard. And yet, though the partitions sealed the coffin, they could not bury the soul. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, erased from maps, remained etched in hearts. Its cities now bore foreign flags, its laws dismantled, its nobles dispersed or humiliated, but across the ravaged countryside and in exile's cold halls, memory burned like a secret flame. Poland did not vanish, it lingered in silence, in the rhythm of old prayers, in the songs of villages, in the haunted gaze of mothers whispering history to children under foreign rule. In this absence, Romanticism rose, not as art alone, but as resistance. Out of ruin came a poetry of mourning and rebellion. Adam Mickiewicz, exiled bard of the lost nation, sang of heroes and ghosts, of Lithuania and Poland as one soul parted by fate. In Pan Tadeusz, he recreated the vanished world in immortal verse, not to forget, but to preserve. Juliusz Słowaki's tragedies and Cyprian Norwid's lonely meditations turned the nation's sorrow into sacred fire. And in the music of Chopin, fragile, defiant, filled with longing, Poland wept and danced in every note. No anthem could match the fury of his mazurkas, no dirge the sorrow of his nocturnes. Each keystroke was a heartbeat of the lost republic. The Commonwealth became legend, not in vain, but in purpose. It lived in rebellion. In the November uprising of 1830, the January uprising of 1863, the whispered dreams of insurgents, the bullets fired in vain, but not without honor. It lived in language, forbidden in schools, but passed from mother to child in lullabies. It lived in the churches, the cemeteries, the battlefields, and in the will of a people who refused to forget who they were. The irony endured too. The very freedom that had once doomed the state became its salvation in memory. Poland, having lost all material shape, became something greater. An idea no border could contain. The nation was no longer merely a place, but a presence. A phoenix, broken and burned, sleeping in its own ash, but not dead, never dead. For what is history, if not a rhythm of rise and fall? And what is Poland, if not the nation that rises again? In the silence after the partitions, the echoes never ceased. They grew louder with time, until, in the crucible of the 20th century, under tanks and tyrants, through war and genocide, Poland rose once more. Not the old Commonwealth reborn in form, but in spirit, a country remembering itself after a century of forgetting. The fall of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a tragedy, but not a defeat. It was a prelude to resilience. A lesson written in blood and fire that nations are not only made of armies and borders, but of dreams that no partition can erase. And so came the end, not with the blaze of a single catastrophe, but in 3 calculated strokes, each more merciless than the last, like wolves tearing at a stag too proud to flee. The partitions of Poland, the murder of a nation in 3 acts, stand not merely as political theft, but as a requiem for one of history's most remarkable experiments in freedom. The Commonwealth, once the vast heart of Europe, was carved apart by the cold blades of Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Its flesh divided, its voice silenced, its spirit condemned to exile. The first partition in 1772 was dressed in false diplomacy, a lie signed in ink but sealed in greed. Poland, weakened by decades of internal paralysis, had become too tempting a prize for its ambitious neighbors. Catherine the Great, Frederick the Great, and Maria Theresa each took their share, claiming to restore balance while stripping the body of a sovereign state. Nearly a third of the Commonwealth vanished overnight. Yet, the king remained. Stanisław August Poniatowski, philosopher king and former lover of Catherine, seated upon a shrinking throne, torn between reason and helplessness. Reform flickered even as borders crumbled. The people wept, but still hoped. Then came the second partition in 1793, more brutal, more cynical. The May 3rd Constitution, that noble cry of rebirth, had terrified the great powers. A free, reformed Poland was too dangerous to be allowed. Catherine unleashed her loyalist pawns, the Targowica Confederation, nobles who cloaked treason in the name of tradition. These Polish traitors, blind to the abyss they invited, welcomed Russian arms to defend liberty, and by doing so helped shatter their own country. Warsaw burned with shame. Nearly everything east of the Vistula was consumed. Only a shell remained, a state in name, a memory in form. And then, after Kosciuszko's broken uprising, came the final act, the third partition in 1795. It was the funeral of a nation. There was no more Poland, no more Sejm, no more king. Stanisław August abdicated, heart heavy with sorrow, and rode into Russian exile. The Grodno Sejm, held under the bayonets of foreign troops, gave the final signature, the execution warrant of a republic that had once spanned from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Even the mapmakers hesitated, as if unable to believe what they had done. And so ended the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. not because it lacked spirit, nor soldiers, nor genius, but because its nobility, so proud of their liberty, could not see how it had become a cage. The great irony, cruel and unforgettable, was this. A state built on the sacred idea of freedom died because it could not reform that very freedom into survival. Liberty without unity became disunity. Disunity invited tyranny. And tyranny, clothed in diplomacy and silence, erased a country from the earth, but not from memory, never from memory, for the names remain. Targowica, Grodno, Rasławicz, Vienna. They burn still. They are whispered in the words of poets, carved into cemetery stones, sung in defiance by generations born in bondage. The flag may have fallen, the borders erased, but Poland's heart still beat. In exile, in song, in sorrow that refused to forget. The murder of the Commonwealth was real, complete, and legal in the eyes of the world, but to Poles, it was not the end. It was the wound that would not heal. The silence before the storm to come. The night before resurrection. Dziękuję. Like and subscribe to restore the Commonwealth.